Genesis brought very radio-friendly, brilliant pop songs.
Absolutely brilliant art rock.
Listen to those albums and you'll see how unusual and how brave they were.
They definitely knew how to do the big rock show.
Genesis formed in 1967 when Peter Gabriel met Tony Banks at the exclusive Charterhouse School in Godalming. The duo had performed in a band called Garden Wall, but created a new collective with fellow students Mike Rutherford and Anthony Phillips.
Genesis are essentially a product of the English public school system. Peter Gabriel, Mike Rutherford and Tony Banks all went to Charterhouse, and it's a very creative environment in the mid to late 60s. As boys at that time were wont to do, they formed a group along with a fellow people called Chris Stewart, who was a drummer.
Jonathan King, the DJ, who was also at school but a few years older, came back, by which point he was working in the record industry and he was looking for acts to sign. And he saw them and managed to convince people to get interested in them.
He gave them the name Genesis, he produced their first album, and he was responsible for getting them a record deal.
King pushed the band towards a mainstream sound for their debut From Genesis to Revelation, looking to acts like the Bee Gees for inspiration. But the band felt constrained as they had more adventurous ambitions and parted ways with King.
I think From Genesis to Revelation was a kind of bit of a false start for the band. It didn't sell well, and it felt very much like they hadn't quite found their sound.
Genesis to Revelation, which is kind of masterminded by King, is very different from certainly what we consider classic Genesis, i.e. the Peter Gabriel lineup, sound like. The album has this harmonious pop vibe to it, which is very uncharacteristic of what will follow.
The debut, like a lot of bands, was sort of feeling about a bit and just kind of copying things that they're really into at the time.
Drummer Chris Stewart left Genesis shortly before the release of the album, and following a line of unsuccessful auditions, they put out an advert to find a replacement.
Phil Collins auditioned for the role of drummer in Genesis, and he was successful. Now, he wasn't a public school boy like the others. He had been to stage school. He was, in fact, a child actor who had leaned towards drumming. And he brought them a certain earthy charm.
He sort of changed the tone of the band in a sense, because he had these three upper middle class, rather serious-minded young men, and then you had this fourth, slightly laddish bloke who came in and hit the drums for them.
Steve Hackett came in at the same time. Now, Steve was a classically influenced guitarist, and he was almost the architect of Genesis's more classical in-tone sound.
With the new lineup, Genesis also developed a new sound. Their ambitious 1972 album Foxtrot became their first to chart in the UK, reaching number 12.
A carved oak table tells a tale.
Foxtrot is one of the standout prog rock records, a much maligned genre, but certainly one of the more exciting records of that genre. I mean, it's got things like the last track, Supper's Delight, which is over 25 minutes long. Certainly indulgent.
They weren't following trends, they were setting them. And that album was the epitome of early Genesis.
There's always been Ethel.
The figure in the red dress and the fox head that featured on the sleeve became a costume that lead singer Peter Gabriel took to the stage.
Mike Rutherford, Tony Banks, Steve Hackett, and to an extent Phil Collins, were not natural performers. So it fell to the singer, Peter Gabriel, to carry these live shows. He did this essentially by dressing up like some kind of am-dram aficionado. So you saw him in these fantastic outfits. He dressed as Britannia. He had my particular favourite, where he seemed to dress as a sunflower.
He was very flamboyant, a performer, basically. And I think My favourite outfit of his was when he kind of dressed up as a cover of Foxtrot and he's wearing kind of a dress and a fox's head. Apparently the rest of the band didn't know he was going to do this before he kind of went out and did it, so that must have been quite a shock for them.
Some of the members of the band started to get a little bit frustrated when the costumes were overshadowing the quite serious music that they were making at that time, and especially on occasion where it was actually very difficult for him to sing into a microphone.
To promote the album The Lamb Lies Down on Broadway, Gabriel devised an elaborate tour featuring numerous set pieces and costume changes. Tensions would rise between the band members as a result.
Gabriel kind of reaches his creative peak with Genesis, with The Lamb Lies Down on Broadway, which is a very ambitious concept album about a Puerto Rican boy called Raul in this kind of mythic, fantastical version of New York, trying to find his identity.
The members of the band who weren't Peter Gabriel had said for quite a long time at that point that there'd been talk of him leaving, so it was certainly not a surprise when it did happen.
People going to hear Steve Hackett's intricate Bach-inspired organ noodling, or are they there to see what costume Peter Gabriel's got on? And it becomes a kind of very jealous thing.
And Peter Gabriel at that point was probably thinking that he was a big enough star in his own right to go solo, and did go on to have enormous solo success.
He was kind of looking at other things, maybe looking at other projects. And finally, I think his wife was pretty sick while having her first child. And he just wanted to kind of stay at home with his wife and child, I think, and look after them.
So Gabriel leaves, and, you know, Genesis become a very different beast.
Bored of the life in the city of gold, he'd left and let nobody know.
The band auditioned over 400 singers to replace Gabriel, but as Phil Collins coached them, it became apparent he should be the one to fill the role. The new Genesis started to make music videos too, the first being the title track for the album A Trick of the Tail.
Such of another to share in his life, but nowhere.
I think he was a good follow-up from Peter Gabriel. It was a good kind of vocal fit for the music that they were making. Also, his voice was quite similar to Peter's. It had a kind of smooth, kind of soulful sound to it.
Am I wrong to believe in the city of gold that lies in...
The advantage of Phil Collins' vocals was that he didn't sound like Peter Gabriel, yet he sounded enough like Peter Gabriel to carry the earlier material, which in the first few years of Phil Collins' tenure as Genesis singer, that they had to include in their live sets until they'd built up enough work without Peter Gabriel to mean that the Genesis, in effect, changed hands, and Phil Collins was now in charge.
During the recording of Wind and Wuthering, guitarist Steve Hackett quit the band due to arguments over his contribution to the album. Now a three-piece, the band released the aptly titled And Then There Were Three, an album that would see the band have worldwide mainstream success. Lead single Follow Me, Follow You was their first US chart hit.
Stay with me, my love. I hope you'll always be right here by my side.
As the title suggests, there were just three of them left. And this was the moment at which they had to take their old audience with them and try to build a new one. So in order to do this, then they got rid of Steve Hackett's more classical overtones and instead sacrificed it for more conventional song structures, which still managed to fly the flag for their prog background. It's a really difficult trick to pull off at that stage in their careers. They did it ever so well.
Days and nights that we know will be out.
It's more accessible, more poppy, more kind of mainstream, and they're kind of thinking about radio records, I think, at this point. They're looking bigger and sort of trying to tap into maybe a bigger audience.
In 1979, the band took some time off as Collins tried to save his marriage. During the hiatus, Collins recorded a solo album which saw him experiment with new drum sounds. When the band returned to work, he brought these sounds to the albums Duke and Abacab.
To me, ooh, it seems that I can speak. Well, I can hear my voice shouting out.
Abacab was the moment that Genesis joined the 80s. And Whereas And Then There Were Three and Duke had been albums which had built on their prog roots and managed to overcome the fact that they'd lost Peter Gabriel, this was the new Genesis, heading for commercial gold.
Yeah, there's no reply at all. There's no reply at all.
It delivers, and you've got to remember, of course, that Phil Collins has basically created the sound of 80s pop/rock records, the gated drum sound on In the Air Tonight. So everything that comes out that has this sound that Collins and Hugh Padgham devise puts Genesis under Collins in this brilliant position to capitalise on something that he kind of pioneered on his solo career.
With me, seems you're never here with me. But I could leave, but I won't go. It'd be easier, I know. I can't feel a thing from my head down to my toes.
As Phil Collins' solo career took off, it helped the band's profile rise even higher. By the time they were recording the self-titled album Genesis, Collins had already released 2 multi-platinum albums of his own.
But I love you more than I wanted to. There's no point in trying to pretend.
Mike Rutherford and Tony Banks initially were probably not very happy about their drummer, stroke singer, going off on his own, because where did that leave them? But I think in the long run it helped Genesis a lot, because Phil Collins went off and he had this really successful career. Unusually successful, considering he's not a typical frontman at all. But he didn't actually leave Genesis for a long time. So when he came back, I think he brought a lot of those fans with him who were probably aware of Genesis but hadn't necessarily dug out their copy of Lamb Lies Down on Broadway. So in the long run, I think it did a lot of good for Genesis.
Upon the release of the 1986 album Invisible Touch, critics were keen to note similarities between the record and Collins' solo output. Intentional or not, the album achieved huge success with sales of over 15 million copies worldwide.
She seems to have an invisible touch. It takes control and slowly tears you apart.
Obviously, the title track is the one that people are most fond of. And certainly that was a definite springboard to helping that record go on to sell 15 million copies.
It was a #1 album in America, which for such a quintessentially English band is a remarkable thing to actually happen. But there was a little bit of funk in there. These songs were very radio friendly. They were very tight.
And now it seems I've fallen for her. She seems to have an invisible touch. She reaches in and grabs right holding your heart.
They somehow managed to move with the times while still seeming quite squared. But it wasn't like they're trying to be young as such. They did seem like a bunch of middle-aged guys. But it just worked. And I think essentially to all their audience, their original members who'd all grown up and had kids and probably, out living in the suburbs or whatever now, they were making music for those people. And so Invisible Touch was a non-threatening pop song, but it wasn't pure pop, which would be embarrassing to listen to, when you're driving home from an insurance conference in your Ford Mondeo.
This is the world we live in, and these are the hands we're given. Use them and let's start trying to make it a place worth living in.
The standout track of Invisible Touch is Land of Confusion. I love this song. It's really interesting because it's kind of a social commentary on the Cold War, what's going on with kind of Reagan, Gorbachev, and just the fact that they're addressing these issues is interesting. They do it in a kind of really smart way.
The men of steel, the men of power.
It shows that they're still not afraid to be intelligent, to kind of look to outer things and outer sources and comment on things. It shows their intelligence as well as their pop sensibilities. I also love the video. It's using spitting image puppets and it's just really striking.
Tell me why this is a land of confusion.
Whilst touring the album, Genesis used new technology for their stage show. The lighting rigs and sound systems they used are now arena concert standards.
Phil Collins had to carry the show. Now, he did this partially with a mix of the proverbial cheeky-chappy charm, which didn't always fit with the grandiosity of some of the music. So there was a gap, and the gap which could only be filled by a pioneering light show. And this was what made the Genesis experience such a visual extravaganza.
Convince you, 'cause you know, baby, that I don't wanna go.
When you went to a Genesis show, it was a huge spectacle. It was an exciting experience. It wasn't just about the music. They were actually using the lights and the visuals and the lasers to enhance the music, which is a really exciting combination.
It was kind of overcompensating for Mike Rutherford and Tony Banks's lack of natural stage presence, but it also formed a counterweight to Phil Collins's cheeky chappiness, and it reminded everybody that this were Genesis.
I would say that they are on an equal footing with Pink Floyd. You know, these are the two bands that went for a big, grandiose sound, and they're also the two bands that when the 80s came, they kind of moved along and they went into a commercial direction which reflected the times in Britain and America in particular. So I would say that they definitely knew how to do the big rock show. They knew how to make it an event. That's a key thing. And I'd imagine bands like U2 took quite a lot from that.
I can dance, I can sing.
Following a hiatus of 5 years, again due to Collins' solo pursuits, the band recorded We Can't Dance. For the accompanying promo, Collins showed what an actor he can be.
Blue jeans sitting on the beach. Her dog's talking to me, but she's out of reach. She's got a body under that shirt, but all she wants to do is rub my face in the dirt. 'Cause I can dance.
Phil Collins took over this role as the man in all of the jeans adverts, which were very popular at the time, and it parodied them. It parodied Genesis's perceived lack of danceability too.
Oh, and checking everything is in place. You never know who's looking on.
I don't think you'd really get a band like Genesis making a video like that, a band from a previous generation, because they were all, how old would they have been, mid-40s?
But that's Phil Collins' strength, actually. He doesn't really take himself too seriously, and also he's prepared to be laughed at, which is unusual in a pop star.
See her smiling through. I never thought so much could happen. Just shoot.
Collins left Genesis in 1996 to focus on his solo career. Rutherford and Banks decided to continue on together and brought in ex-Stiltskin singer Ray Wilson for vocals.
You say that I put chains on you, but I don't think that's really true.
When Peter Gabriel had left, there were suggestions that Genesis might call it a day. When Phil Collins left, the stakes, I think, were a little bit too high for Mike Rutherford and Tony Banks to think about giving up Genesis.
To the Congo, I'm free to leave. There's always somewhere anybody can leave. Send me to the Congo, you have to believe. You can do it if you wanna, just do what you please.
Most people would agree that after We Can't Dance, Genesis struggled with identity. They tried a new singer who was in the band Stiltskin, who had a big song on a Levi's advert at some point in the 90s called Inside. But I don't think it really struck a chord either with their devoted fans or with the public, really.
Ray Wilson was, and still is probably, a fine singer, but he wasn't really a Genesis singer. And in the event, he lasted for just one album, and he parted in some acrimony. There were no real bonds between Mike Rutherford and Tony Banks and Ray Wilson, and it was too late in the day for Ray Wilson to reclaim Genesis's back catalogue.
I don't really think it was a great album, but I don't necessarily think it was a bad idea to continue with that Collins. They tried it. And, you know, you've got to remember they didn't have Phil Collins in the very early days. Actually, I think it was that the band's span, as always happens with bands, it had come to an end. you know, and it was a pretty good run.
There is lambs wool under my naked feet.
The lineup of Gabriel, Collins, Banks, Hackett and Rutherford reformed for a new recording of the Carpet Crawlers in 1999 to promote a greatest hits compilation. Although Gabriel and Hackett wouldn't commit to it, the rest of the group toured together in 2006, nearly 40 years since the band first formed.
Trapped in birth on celluloid.
Because Phil Collins and Peter Gabriel have very much extant solo careers, because Mike Rutherford and Tony Banks haven't retired, because Steve Hackett is available, then these people have not burnt their boats. They may reform, they may not.
There's no hiding in my memory.
There would definitely be some intrigue and some interest if the Peter Gabriel lineup was to go out on the road again.
Gabriel seems to have gone so far away from Genesis and is enjoying terrific success at the moment with the So 25th anniversary tour. He has no need to go back into that.
They've more lifeblood than before. They're moving in time.
I would like to see Genesis to get back together. I'd like to see Peter Gabriel dressed as a giant daffodil, leaping about the stage as much as age allows. I don't think we're ever going to see Phil Collins playing drums again.
They're calling.